Now you're listening into Paul's Unscripted podcast.
Have you ever had an incident where, you'd be in bed lying down or you'd be going about your day and then all of a sudden the most terrible of thoughts would come to your brain and then you just think to yourself, how could I have conceived of that? Am I an evil person? Or, for example, an old woman is crossing the street and then you start imagining that, she's not going to live a very long life or something terrible is going to happen to her. Or you have these like violent outbursts. Has that ever happened to you? Or is that just like a
Yeah,
weird psychotic thing that I have?
it kind of happened to me. Kind of, I'm like even with a friend do say that I'm kind of my brain's kind of work like a psychopath or something related to that. Because sometimes when I'm with my friend and when there's time he annoyed me or he or she annoyed me or and then that thing had been happened like long time ago, and then like we're at this cafe and stuff like that, and then I was thinking to myself, what happened if I like kill her right now or kill him right now,
Yeah, what could
or
happen? I'm just
what will
curious.
happen to me? Yeah,
I wouldn't do it, but I'm so curious.
yeah, the question of what if kind of blew my mind of like, oh, if this happened, what will happen to me, what will happen to my parents if they knew this, and it kind of throws you into a loop, into thinking this like infinite situation, but in the end I'm just drinking coffee with her or with him and just enjoying my time.
And all this like
There's nothing
stuff is going on in
serious.
your head. Yeah. I don't
Yeah.
know, maybe a bit of it is how if you're ever bored, right? There's this whole scientific study that they conducted that if you're bored for extended periods of time, you will choose pain, you will choose chaos, anything that would get you
Yeah.
out of that, lull, if you will. And I think a lot of what our brain does maybe functions that way, where inactivity or being, quarantine can make you go crazy if you live by yourself, or
Yeah,
just we don't
true.
really, I think, can quite conceive of why certain thoughts occur to us, but sometimes they can be very dangerous. I
Yeah.
think I've had dreams of like my past interactions with people, and maybe they are of a intimate nature, if you will. And then for the next couple extended days, you actually believe those emotions that were listed in your dreams are of a true nature. But
Yeah.
then, to what extent could you say,
um,
well, that's not real, and this is real?
I mean, like that kind of comes from our animalistic behavior back in like in olden days, especially within the caveman era, where we are trying to survive and we don't want to be within this bubble. And back in the days, of course, like being a caveman, we are focusing on uh like survival of the fittest. We're trying to survive the life that we have right now. And then what they usually do is they would like be very cautious and very focused on the bad things, for example snakes or things that could harm them, rather than enjoying their life. Oh, look at what I have farm, I have animals, and I have like people around me. They won't focus on that. People, because back in those days people were more focused on the survivals, and they don't have the, what can you say, luxury of like thinking or to care about one another, kind of like that.
That is so true. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, how many, even right now, it's not everybody that has the privilege of sitting down like us and really thinking, but why?
Yeah.
And just
True.
indefinitely, but why? Because all you need to think about is survival, making your pay. Some people, collect garbage for a living. Some people make very little per day to think about, bettering the world, or even thinking about, them as human being, how they've evolved, right? So I think
Yeah.
hunter gatherers definitely, for a very long time, would have been on their guard the whole time. It would never have a moment
Yeah.
of peace, and then eventually, broken down in smaller communities, because you can't possibly sustain interpersonal relationships with more than 200 persons at once.
True. Yeah. I
I
mean,
read,
like,
yeah, I've actually read somewhere. I don't know if this is true, completely, but I read it from *Sapiens*, the book, about how the agricultural revolution was, a sham, and it allowed us to survive for longer, but in the most terrible of conditions through farming, and
That's
how out
interesting.
of every other ailments, farming was something that caused people the most debilitation. They would, be in the sun, maybe without, of course, like at that time, sunscreen or protection from the sun's rays. So they would, develop all sorts of, other ailments as well, such as, backaches and,
Yeah.
everything else that came with it. And we just kept going that way, and we've survived as long as we have, I think, in worse conditions. But I've read also somewhere that right now there are more slaves than there've ever been before, which I'm really not sure about that.
What do you mean by that? I mean, we do right nowadays. We do trade for services. I don't know if that
Oh, you mean
count
like
as
a broad
slavery.
category?
Yeah.
No, but in their terms, slaves mean more of people who maybe willingly, ownership of like persons, which could be maybe, human trafficking in their terms. I'm not thinking, well,
Oh yeah. Okay.
I'm not thinking like,
Probably. Yeah.
you're in servitude because you're, a waitress at like a coffee shop. Nothing along those lines.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't gone into a whole, research about it, but it could be true, I guess, since this is also considered, um, the least violent that we've ever been in the history of humankind. But then contrasting with everything that's going on, maybe the scales are not the same. If you were to say, well,
Yeah.
how do you measure this and that, right? And just going back to that conversation we had before too, about in what ways are we complicit in perpetuating, certain biases, where as a scientist or as, a researcher or a learner, to what extent can you use information that's been acquired through unethical means, right? When they
Yeah.
conducted those experiments on Jews, and then we've realized, how long it would take to submerge somebody's head underwater until they could drown, or other experiments that are horrific in that way.
Yeah. I'm like, in the end, you kind of need to draw a line where should be the last. How can I say it? The last worst thing that you could do to human. I mean, even within the scientific field, in my field, biomedical field, we have like certain set of rules that we need to hire, ethical rules in terms of experimenting with animals, such as rats, mice, and all that. So yeah, if we don't like adhere to that, it kind of bring a bad rap for a scientist. Especially when there's I think there's a case back in 2010 2012, something like that, about this facility containing monkeys that they had been like used for scientific studies on, and then the condition that the monkeys are in are very, very poor and bad, and that kind of enraged the public opinion on like why is it important for scientists to do like animal testing. And for me, that kind of acts as a Pandora's box. You can't really like, I mean, for me, animal testing is very, very important in terms of researching medicine and all that stuff, because we can't really like experiment on human beings unless if there's like a volunteer for it, sure, but I don't think so. I don't think that people would like to be within that trial or experiment. So basically what we're doing right now is, with the use of animal testing, we kind of filter out the negative effects that could have happened towards human. Do you understand that? Yeah. So that's why, so in the end product that the human receive probably going to be the least dangerous, kind of, by sacrificing the animals and all that.
And
Yeah, it's
if
kind of
you're
contradicting the.
well, it's hard, I
But
guess.
yeah,
It's hard because you do need to acquire that information for the betterment, for this knowledge that could potentially save human lives. But it's also terrible because you can't really acquire consent from these animals.
yeah, true. So that's why most of researchers right now, especially within the biomedical field, they are more prone into moving toward cell culture studies, because you don't really need consent unless you're taking a cell out of a person, and of course then you need the consent of that person to like allow the scientists to use their cells and their organs or whatnot. So yeah, moving, like it kind of a new emerging field. It's not new it's already old for like 50 to 60 years, but
Well, that is young, compared
nowadays
to
people
everything else.
people are more focused within cell study rather than doing directly towards animal study. So
What
so
would you
it
call
kind
that?
of filter out the dangerous things actually. So if we start with cells and then we filter out the toxic stuff, and then we move on to animals, and then we move on to humans. Yeah, so that's kind of the, how can you say, the flow, the workflow of like scientific research within
Like you wouldn't
medicine.
go to human
kind of.
experimentation until it is necessary or required to, or
Yeah,
if your
true.
hypothesis could be, tested completely without having to resort
Yeah.
to those more extreme means. I think that's, again, it's valuable work that a lot of scientists don't get, credit for enough, I think. I definitely,
Yeah.
I've been involved in more psychological tests, but a lot of it had to do with the correlation between certain things, and they find this pattern of behavior. I have been part of, a lot of eye movement tracking versus, my ability to concentrate and recognition skills and memory and so forth, and whether or not, there is any correlation at all between the two. I have had on one account also been involved in another study where I had to basically decide whether or not I want to put in, this $10 bill inside a box, believing that I have another participant in another room that would also believe that I would put in the $10 bill, and if we both decide so at the same time, we'll get we get an additional $10 or so forth. Just on, I believe, on whether or not you would. And then after that, at the end of the study, they decided that they would take like a bit of my saliva as well. Of course,
why?
this is part of my university study.
Are,
I don't.
are there correlation between saliva and the way that you act, or the way that you behave?
Maybe, but it's sounding all very Pavlovian at the moment.
I see.
I haven't actually followed up on that study at all, but I know that my saliva is out there somewhere. So a piece of my DNA is out there somewhere. But it's definitely for a good cause. It was like a whole consent form. It was part of the university. A lot of it was, paid for a good amount, and some of it was just, just volunteer, really. A lot of it was just volunteer. So that was fun to do. But again, implications, right? I don't believe in people going on those ancestry sites and getting their DNA tested unless they plan to break apart their entire families, because I've heard certain stories. One being on Reddit that I saw recently. I'm a big proponent of the Reddit community. I use it for all sorts of purposes. But in one particular subreddit on relationships, there was a family that came out about a particular problem that they had. Quite controversial was that there were two families that lived side by side in this neighborhood, and they were really closely knitted, and they had their own children's, boys and girls on both sides. And then, obviously, as is the case with most, neighboring communities, is that you start to develop really close, interpersonal relationships and bonds. So I remember that one of the boys, teenager boy at the house, decided to date, his neighbor, this other female at the house. And they were engaged in, a sexual and, romantic relationship without having revealed this to their families yet. And then when they did, they'd realized that actually they were the products of the same father. You know how there's a bit of incestuous relationships going on here,
that's Game of Thrones thing.
That's Game of Thrones, yeah, where apparently the parents had done a bit of a swapping ceremony of some sort, or maybe there was an affair. Who knew?
Cheating on your neighbor, I see.
And then you exchange the children, and then say nothing about it without having to think about what would happen, what are the consequences. Maybe
That's so weird, though.
Yeah, and then having this be this long family secret, right?
Yeah.
But as icky as that sounds, I mean, I think it happens all the time. Maybe almost as common as this other type of what we call that. Some people have this attraction, this natural attraction to another person, and it's more so, I don't know, it's like pheromones or whatnot, but there's lots of cases of children who have been abandoned at birth and then reunited with their birth parents and then feel this attraction to them. And because they've never, experienced that before, they consider this intense emotion to equate to love. And then they decide to engage in this sexual and romantic relationship. So I definitely think it's not uncommon.
That's weird.
That is weird, but it happens all the time, right? So if you ever, and that is probably one of the first things that you should do when, you ever get into a new relationship, is that make sure you're not at least, third cousin down, check your lineage.
Yeah. I mean, even though in Islam they permitted the believers to marry their cousin, but it is not suggested to do that, because
I don't think it's ever
if you
suggested.
can marry your cousin, you're going to it kind of comes as an inbreed. Your what do you call it? Your children going to be so fucked up genetically that they would die in 10 to 20 years time. I'm like, there's a lot not some of my friend, I have one friend, his parents are very, very, not his parents, his family are very big into this cousin to cousin marrying thing.
They're into that whole cousin.
Yeah, I was like, okay, that's a bit
Is it to keep the power in the family? Is it supposed to keep in the family's wealth and prestige?
Probably not about the wealth. It's probably because of the knowledge that they have. This mythical, probably mythical knowledge that mystical knowledge that they have. So they're trying to
preserve that.
So what happened is that his father married to his cousin, which is his mother, if I'm not mistaken, and then the problem that he have right now is that he has scoliosis, and not a severe form of scoliosis, but there's a form of scoliosis and a form of what you call inbreed disease,
which is very clear.
So so from that, and his brother, I think he have a psychological mental illness, I guess. I don't know if it's bipolar or something like that.
Oh, well, that's a lot of hereditary genetic.
Yeah, and that's the fucked up thing about it, and we kind of need to understand God already gave us the sign that, okay, if you're gonna do this incest thing, you're gonna end up having this kind of children, and do you want that?
But aren't we all products of incest? I mean, if you're considering that biblical records are correct,
in terms of the bigger population,
or even just again, it's gotten so diluted that it's okay, right? But the first people who've done it are probably not in a good place,
Yeah,
right?
the Adam and Eve, right?
Yeah, or
Yeah.
Genghis Khan, which is probably where our ancestors are
Yeah.
from, considering we're
Yeah.
Southeast Asian. But
True. I mean, like most of the people within the East Asia are descendants of Genghis Khan because he raped a lot of women and I don't know what's wrong with him.
yeah,
Freaking
it's just
Genghis Khan,
at
man.
least I mean, it's now been completely part of the population that you're not noticing the ill effects of it. But I can't imagine that it has completely ceased, like this whole inbreeding, but also the male population, some parts of the male population, particular people that maybe feel the need to copulate and have lots of children, to the point where it's honestly shocking. Where in one case, there was a man who had so many children that he actually only knows them by numbers.
What? That's very sad. Was he a sperm donor or he just like
He just
fuck
wanted
a lot
many
of
wives.
girls?
So the thing about it was that he wasn't
Oh my god.
particularly rich or attractive, and he was kind of disabled. He couldn't walk very well, and he was already old. But he had these
Oh, that's
wives
a
that
weird character.
like he had a lifelong agenda, which was to reproduce and have as many children as possible. And his wives felt that because they loved him, they would help him in this goal, so that they would forfeit their marriage so he could remarry and keep copulating.
Oh, that's weird, man.
It was just
Oh
like
my
this
god.
is they're just like disposable, right? And it just keeps going on. And I think to myself, well, how do you even keep track of that? Like, you're number 15, go fetch me some coffee. Number 100,
Number
like,
number 105. Go get me some food or something like that.
just, I mean, wouldn't it be easier to just remember them by name?
Oh yeah. I mean, like if you remember a person by name, it would mean like a lot more
A lot more.
for
And
the
yeah, it's
child. Yeah.
face and then name, and rather than like a number, which I think it's really hard like to remember, and especially if it's like a pattern of names, or like alphabets and numbers, which is even more difficult
Yeah.
to remember.
I'm like even prisoners have like names that the guards like call them to. I'm like kind of even worse than prisoner, and like to call your child by a number. That's
Yeah.
kind of fucked up.
That's kind of
in
that is
so
that is
many levels.
Yeah, well, I don't doubt at all that these children would turn out a certain way in the future, and having like really misplaced feeling, like a lack of identity. I think that's very important. Naming things, naming, not just things, because when we know something, it is no longer in the dark, and it becomes more palpable, I think. A lot of them, I actually had the opportunity to do a particular class that talked about psychoanalysis in literature. And a lot of it was that, where, a lot of the patients had issues coming to terms with the emotions that they felt, their experiences, until sitting down and talking about them and actually naming them. So there is a lot of power and authority that goes into, making something known, giving it a label. Yes, it's real, but it also means that now you can, comprehend it and understand it. There was, I know this is quite, problematic. He's considered really problematic, psychologist of his time, but Freud actually did come up with a lot of these, theories. This whole introspection thing, where you sit down and, without any script, so to speak, or in any order, you actually do empty out your brains, you empty out your mind, and you talk about whatever it is that's going on. And he was, quite certain that it would allude to a certain pattern, which should give us insight into what this person was, feeling, and how you could fix it. But that's only the extent that I endorse his work. Everything else is quite racist. A lot of it,
Well, I mean, like that's an interesting like approach in like getting to know like other people even better, or getting intimate with the other people. Yeah.
There was a certain story that also, I think, really stuck with me for a long time, where he talked about the importance of dreams. It's from one of his, seminar works. But he talked about a story that has been passed down in his family, and he's heard of it somewhere, where a man who had recently lost his child in a burning fire and unable to, help him or resuscitate him, the child, falls to his death. And then as he was able to organize some sort of funeral ceremony for the child, or if you may call it a viewing, days when the corpse is still kept in the home, being buried or cremated and whatnot, he decided that he would have another person, who would make sure that everything was well taken care of at the coffin, that the candles surrounding the area will not fall and, burn off the coffin, as he, briefly took a nap after having been, awake and extremely miserable for days, grieving the death of his child. And in his dream, he dreamt that his child had come back to life completely, in flames and looking completely disorientated and disheveled, calling out to him and saying, "Father, why won't you save me?" And it was this very nightmarish image of the guilt that he had, from not being able to save that child.
Guilt, yeah.
But then also it actually woke him up to see that the man that he had hired to keep an eye out on the coffin had fallen asleep, and so the candles were in the process of burning his child's coffin. So there is some, psychological elements, but there was also this other purpose of waking him up to, actually stop the burning and be able to, I guess, redeem himself, and feeling like, hey, I was there for my child at this time, I was able to save him, and therefore I'm not a terrible father and whatnot. But a lot of it was just really haunting. That whole thing was just really haunting. I think it's a good exercise, obviously, to examine like the subconscious, the unconscious, So yeah, I do see certain significance in that. But a lot of his work talks about condensation, and talks about how you collapse certain characters, certain people in your life, and make them one and the same, if you will.